Here's Harold.
Well, this afternoon it says that I'm going to talk about change or getting the patient to move. Because other than that, you've merely had good discussions or bad discussions with your patient, but they haven't made any difference in his life. Now, in some therapies, that's sufficient. You help the patient to develop insight, so-called, and on the basis of insight, he may choose to change, but he doesn't have to change. He's just learned what makes him tick or whatever. So, for us, as I said last night, insight is not insight unless there's a change component in it. So, you have to figure out how to get the patient to move. And on the one hand, every patient wants to move, and every patient doesn't want to move. It's dangerous to lead a different kind of life than the one you've been leading all your life. You may not have the know-how for doing it, at least so you see yourself. And who knows what happens if I do change. Maybe it'll be a disaster. And what if I fall on my face while I change? Won't that be terrible? And every patient is confronted with the question, in some form or another, that Hamlet had to answer, and that was whether to bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. You know, the devil you know against the devil you don't, that kind of thing. Or, as a psychoanalyst 50 years ago put it, every therapy is an eternal conflict between the couch and the door. So, you know, you can be sympathetic to the patient who struggles to solve this problem. You know, the one Jimmy Durante raised. Did you ever have the feeling that you wanted to go, that you wanted to stay, that you wanted to go, that you wanted to stay, etc.? And some people leave therapy without solving that problem. And eventually they come back to another therapist and struggle with the problem with another therapist because it's too dangerous to step or take a step forward. So we have to help them get past that particular point and get them to move. Because even if the patient says, I am committed to staying in this spot, as one very famous American psychologist put it after analysis, well, I'm so old, so what difference does it make if my roof leaks a little bit? I don't get terribly wet. I can live with the same old roof. So some people decide, okay, I'm glad to know that I'm vulnerable to this or that or the other thing, but I can live with it. But others are looking for a way out because the way they're living their lives is not the way they really want to live their lives. And many times they ask you, and sometimes they demand it, and sometimes they just would be happy if you would recommend a way of solving this particular problem. So, let me give you some possible ways of helping people to change Again, there are hundreds of these for any creative therapist. One is to spit in the patient's soup. That's not a delicate image, but it's the one that Adler wrote about. And his feeling was, if you make the soup unpalatable, there's a good chance the patient would not eat it. Of course, we know there's some patients you tell the unpalatable thing and they still want to eat the soup. But mostly that's not true. So if you spit in the patient's soup, he might move and do it differently. I had a patient, college student, who measured everything in terms of masculinity. I mean everything. If he did it this way, he was more masculine, and if he did it that way, he was less masculine. And being masculine was terribly important. He had a masculine protest. And he would come in most every week, bruised, cut, etc., because he was in a fight during the week, or maybe a couple of fights during the week, because he wasn't going to let them do that, and he don't take no crap from nobody, and similar kinds of things, and proved it with his fists, etc., so that these were a symbol of his masculinity. Just look how many cuts and bruises and black and blue marks and all that kind of stuff. I couldn't get through to him. And he just felt, even if he gets hurt, at least they'll know that it was a man who hit the ground, not a sissy or some unmanly kind of thing. So he wouldn't go out with girls at school, because if he let a girl get close enough to him, she'd find out that he wasn't the man he pretended to be, or he knew he was not, but wouldn't let on. And I had trouble getting him to do that, but finally he agreed to test the waters and go out with women. And he developed what in theater is called a shtick, a routine. He'd take a girl to a bar or a restaurant, and then somewhere during or after the meal, etc., he would turn to a man sitting next to him at the bar or at the next table in the restaurant and say, "I don't like the way you're looking at my girl." Well, most men whom he challenged that way just move further down the bar. Why deal with this nut, etc.? And he, one night, pulled it to impress the girls with what a real man he was. And the man whom he challenged took out a pistol from the back of his belt, held it up to my patient and said, "And what do you want to make of it?" Well, he decided to back down, fortunately, but now he had trouble confessing to me what a coward and unmasculine person he was and that kind of thing. So we had some go-arounds talking about that. And this time I had a bit more effect. He came in still bruised and that kind of thing. And as he talked about it, he seemed to be bragging. And I confronted him and said, "You must be the most vain man I ever ran into in my life." And he puffed himself up and said, "What's wrong with that?" I got reason to be vain. And I countered that with, as an English lit major, you should know what Shakespeare said. Vanity, thy name is woman. That's spitting in the patient's soup. It's no longer as tasty as it was just a minute ago. You see. And most patients will use that confrontation as an opportunity to change. It's not an immediate, complete, comprehensive change necessarily, but they stop boasting about it. And we go on from there, you see. So we spit in the patient's soup, and that sometimes moves them along. Another is to avoid a trap. And there are all kinds of traps. Some are so subtle you don't even know that the patient is working you. So sometimes the question is, well, I know I need to change, but doctor, what would you do if you were me? And I learned the response from Dr. Dreikers, and that was, if I were you, I'd do exactly what you're doing. So let's talk about what you would do if you were not the you are right now. Sometimes patients in not wanting to move will get into a frenzy. And they are so terribly upset the world's coming to an end, etc. And they want you to get equally upset, to validate their upset. And they complain to you when you don't get upset. Here my world is coming to an end and you're just sitting there being calm and relaxed and that kind of thing. I tell them you have a serious problem. And given a serious problem that it is, I think it would be in your best interest if one of us stayed calm. Which would you prefer? Sometimes the patient won't move because he sees your request for movement to be unfair. How can you expect me to do this kind of thing, to move, when I had the kind of family of origin that I had? You are so unfair. Now, there's an immediate tendency on the part of therapists to defend themselves. How can you say I'm unfair? Etc. And Dreikers used to handle that so beautifully. He'd smile at the patient. He says, "You're right. It is an unfair world. With all the fair therapists in the city of Chicago, you had to pick the one that's unfair." Sometimes the patient demands that you do something which runs counter to what you believe therapeutically. And sometimes it can become rather extreme. I had one such student in the class I taught in Vancouver, and he was an obsessive compulsive. And he could not stand certain words. So when I use those words, and I'm not talking about obscenities or whatever, he'd stand up in class and say, "Cancel, cancel, cancel, cancel." And if he recited that, then of course it was as if it had never been uttered by me, and his ears had not heard words which somehow or other were, I don't know, impure to him, that kind of thing. So patients ask all kinds of things of therapists that therapist is not inclined, doesn't make good therapy. For example, I make a decision with many patients to send them to group therapy in lieu of or in addition to individual therapy. And the patient doesn't like it. And they keep arguing, I'd like to continue with individual therapy. After all, individual therapy, I have you the whole hour, and here I got to share you with 6 or 7 other people. And you know how difficult it is for me to talk in front of a group, which may be why I want to be in a group. And they come up with a zillion arguments. So can't I be in individual therapy? Now, when I feel that with this particular patient, group therapy is the treatment of choice, I do not let the patient talk me out of it. So I tell the patient, you know, if I were to accede to your demand, I would be doing second-class therapy. And I have enough respect for myself as a therapist that I am unwilling to do second-class therapy. If you absolutely choose to have second-class therapy, I'll be happy to refer you to a good number of therapists who do that kind of therapy. Nobody over the years has ever accepted referral. Now, that doesn't mean I never change my mind. I do. Sometimes the patient makes a good argument. I say, well, let's try it your way and let's see what happens. But when I am firmly convinced that this would be counter-therapeutic, then I give them a speech of that kind, letting them know I ain't going to do it. There are the patients who stall therapy and don't listen. And if I make an interpretation, say, you're all wrong. And of course, the first impulse on the part of most therapists is to defend yourself. or at best, not defend yourself, but say, tell me where I'm wrong, or some such thing like that. It may be useful to find out what the patient feels about your being wrong, but do not leap to defend yourself. What I do is I say, come on, nobody gets it that perfect, so I must have done something right. Let's discuss the thing I did right. And that helps get through some of the resistance. So there are a good number of trap avoidance. Let's talk about you, doctor. How do you handle this stuff? Are there times you feel anxious, etc.? And they want to divert the therapy from themselves onto somebody else. And of course, you have to resist that too. I tell them I had my own therapy 60 years ago. Now it's your turn. I use myths, fables, and material like that to convey to patients things I want to convey. Now, they don't in education invest much time in myths anymore or fables, and consequently most younger therapists don't know about this kind of important resource. If you don't know them, get a copy of Aesop's Fables, unless you're going to work in Montreal, where I had to get a copy of La Fontaine's Fables. And there are plenty of books on mythology. They even have children's books on mythology. And here, you're going to have to learn something that I didn't have to learn, and that is, I learned Greek mythology and Roman mythology, but up here, you got to also learn something or know something about Norse mythology. If you don't know who Thor was, you're in big trouble with some patients. And therapists have their favorite fables. In fact, one of my students did her master's paper on the most widely used fables used by Adlerian therapists. So she wrote Adlerian therapists over the country. So, do you use fables? And if so, which ones do you like? And it was published as an article, I think, so you have access to it. Her name is Chris Pansner, P-A-N-C-N-E-R. If you look at adlerbiblio.com, you'll have 30,000 references, Adlerian references, that I've put on the internet. So if you plug in her name, you'll get a list of things that she's published. And some are really good. You know, there was this hermit who lived out of town. And one night, the town burned down. So he went looking for another town he could live outside of.
That's great.
And these things make a point. I gave you the fable before of the miller, etc. Makes a point. Aesop, for one thing, always has a moral. You see. So there are many, many ways using this kind of material of getting through the patient and inviting him to move. A major way that some people move their patients is through time limits. Freud had people complain that it took too long to be analyzed. After all, 5 days a week for maybe 15 or 20 years takes a lot of time. So he assigned 2 analysts, Otto Rank and Sándor Ferenczi, to explore whether psychoanalysis could be shortened, made more affordable, that kind of thing for patients. And Otto Rank came up with establishing a time limit. So he'd do an interview or 2 with the patient, and then he'd say, I think we ought to be able to accomplish this in 6 months and help you with your problem. And they'd work together 6 months, and then the patient became an ex-patient, wherever it was he happened to be at the moment. And if he worked hard and met Rank's estimate, then he had a complete therapy in a shorter time. And this was taken up here in the States, in Chicago, by the Carl Rogers Group. And they and the Adlerian Group decided on a joint therapy project. Every patient they had and every patient we had was given 20 interviews to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. And we thought, boy, will that put pressure on patients. You know, they got to do it all in 20 hours. We didn't realize how much pressure it put on us as therapists. Should I talk about this or should I talk about that? Should I let the patient keep talking or should I shut him up? After all, I got to get this done in 20 interviews. And that research is published. If you look up in the internet, in the adlerbiblio.com, you will find reference to this research. The major investigator was John Schlein, S-H-L-I-E-N. He was from the other group. And Dreikers and I were the investigators for the Adlerian group. And 20 interviews worked very, very well with most patients. Most patients made major changes because they didn't have time to dawdle. Mm-hmm. So, some of us set limits, time limits, regularly, but some do it for other purposes. I use it for a termination technique. And if the patient has what I call the cold feet syndrome, gee, I know I'm well enough to leave therapy, but gee, if I stick my foot in the waters, I'll freeze. And I have to help them leave therapy. So I tell them, well, let's see, we got to cover this and this. That'll take about 7 or 8 interviews. So let's say we agree that you will have 7 or 8 more interviews, and then we'll call it quits. Or I may say to another patient, not in terms of termination, if I see no significant movement on your part in 2 months, I'll know that the therapy is failing you and you would be better off seeing another therapist or another form of therapy or whatever. And I move the patient either along or out using this. I also use a technique based on a phrase that Adler adopted from Hans Wegener. Wegener was a philosopher who wrote a book which impressed Adler. It was The Psychology as If. And I'm not going to go into the whole philosophy of Wegener, but I'll tell you how I use it in therapy and others use it. When a patient says, I am not, or I can't, or whatever, he sometimes excuses himself even from trying. I'm not that kind of person, etc. So, the person may say, I'm not, to use the illustration I just used before, I'm not masculine enough. So I tell him, for 1 week between now and the next time I see you, I would like you to act as if you are the real man you want to be. And then the patient will come up with certain gambits. It would be phony. No, it's not phony. After all, when you see an actor on the stage, he's acting as if. You don't stand up and say, get off the stage, you phony. I know that's not the real you. You're not Hamlet. You know that it's an act. So I would like you to act as if you were a real man. I wouldn't even know how to start. Well, okay, whom do you regard in reality, in the movies, TV, etc., as a real man? John Wayne. Okay, for next week, I would like you to act as if you were John Wayne. And if you don't know exactly what to do in any particular situation, you ask yourself, what would John Wayne do in this situation? And do that. And then there are usual things, oh, but that's hard, and all of that. You'll have to learn how to deal with all of those gambits that patients pull because they're afraid. So they agree that for the next week, they're going to act as if they were real, whatever. So I tell them this bit about informed consent. And they don't understand. Well, again, how could this be dangerous? And I point out the dangers before asking for informed consent. So I say, let me tell you the dangers. They can be exemplified in an old, again, Hungarian story. And the story is of a young man in a Hungarian village who was terribly ugly. He was so ugly that when people walked down the street toward him, they crossed the street so that they wouldn't have to look at his face. That's how ugly he was. And he had basically no life in this village. But he did have one compassionate friend. And on this particular day, our central character poured out his heart to his friend and said, "Why did God punish me by making me this ugly? Now, I'm not saying I want to be handsome, but this ugly that people are afraid to look at me." And other people have a social life. Other men date women, and I will never experience any of this. And his compassionate friend said, "Not necessarily so." He said, "How can you say that? Just look at me." He said, "Well, in the village across the river, there is a mask maker who makes masks that are so realistic you cannot tell them from real flesh. So let's go across and get you measured for a mask." And then I put in the patient's mouth the arguments he's raised already, so I get an opportunity to shoot him down a second time. So this ugly man said, "But that would be phony," etc. And finally, having gotten through that a second time, I continue with the story. So they went across the river and they got him fitted for a mask, and by golly, it did look like real flesh. So he came back to his own village, and everybody wondered, who was this handsome young man, this stranger, new to the village? And suddenly he had a social life, and mothers were proposing their daughters to him and all kinds of things. He dated, he was having a ball, but he had an underlying fear. Someday he would be found out. But he had enough courage to decide that, by golly, I'm going to play out the string. I'm going to enjoy myself until the moment I'm found out. So he participated in social activities. He began to date women, and he finally found one with whom he fell in love, and she fell in love with him. And now they had reached the crisis point. And one day she said, "Let's get married." "Well, we can't get married because of this, and we can't get married because of that." And she said, "I can't understand you. You're in love with me, I'm in love with you, and yet you raise all of these obstacles. What's wrong?" And he felt he couldn't hold out any longer. And he said, "There's something about me you don't know. And if you knew it, you wouldn't even consider marrying me." And she said, "I know everything about you I need to know. I can't understand this craziness." And he said, "Okay, I have to let you know." And he reached over and he pulled off his mask and he said, "Now, do you still want to marry me?" And she said, "Why not?" And he said, "Looking the way I look, you still want to marry me?" She said, "How do you look?" And he turned around and he looked in the mirror. And you know what? He looked just like his mask. And that could just happen to you. So, a good number of stories of that kind are available to use to help people. Try it. See. We also use real life people to get people to move. A person will come in I failed at everything. I failed at this, I failed at that, I failed at the other thing. And I tell them, let me tell you something about the history of the cure of syphilis. The first cure of syphilis, which occurred early in the 20th century, came from Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who won the Nobel Prize for it. And he found a medication which had a formal technical name, but nobody called it that. It was known as 666. Do you know why it was called 666? Because the first 665 medications didn't work. So even if you have failed this many times, what difference does it make? You keep trying until you find what you need. Or the patient coming up with, I failed more times than I've succeeded. And paradoxically, I tell them, hey, that's great. Now, they can't understand that. So they ask me to explain, what do you mean, great? I failed twice as many times as I've ever succeeded. And I point out, if you're a baseball player and you want to command a high salary, what should be your batting average, roughly? And I only use this, of course, with people who know this kind of stuff. It's their idiom. And they say, well, if you hit 300, by golly, you can really command whatever salary you're looking for. And I say, well, what does 300 mean? It means that they failed 7 times, and they've only hit 3 times. And that's twice as many times that they failed as they've hit. And I follow that up with baseball aficionados, with asking him about Babe Ruth. I'll ask him, in the 154 game season, who holds the record for home runs? And if they're old enough, they remember it was Babe Ruth. And then I ask them, and who holds the major league record for strikeouts in a season? And that they usually don't know. But it's the same Babe Ruth. Mm-hmm. So even if you fail considerably, you can still be a major success. With patients who won't buy interpretations from me and resist, etc., I break up this kind of resistance and get them to move. Not every time, of course. By telling them that therapy is a 2-person game which is zero sum. Meaning, if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And the amount I win by is the same amount that you lose by, and vice versa. And I'm sorry, I said it's a 2-sum game. It is not a zero-sum game. You see, therapy differs from a zero-sum game is, if I win, you win. you'll be better off. And if you win, you lose. So why don't you throw the game to me? There's also the use of illustration. Somebody's accomplished something, well, why can't you accomplish the same thing? Or, for that matter, the fact that somebody has accomplished something, like your father, why can't you accomplish something? It doesn't have to be what your father accomplished, but you can have your own accomplishments. I sometimes give mantras to patients to move them. I gave a patient, a woman, on Wednesday, a mantra which she has to recite 3 times a day and once before bed. And that is, I am lovable. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate that you'll immediately believe it. But at least it will break up the stream of cognitions that center around I am unlovable. I sometimes, with obsessive compulsives or with hypochondriacs, well, again, I behave paradoxically. You see, when a person is hospitalized with hypochondriasis, for example, anytime one of the helpers, whether it's a nurse, a doctor, a psychologist, whatever, comes into the ward, they race toward them so that they can tell about their latest symptom. And of course, the personnel know about this, so they get into the ward very quickly and hide. They go into the nurse's station and close the door and that kind of thing. I behave paradoxically. When I come in the ward, I go over and I greet them just as I would anybody else. I'm a friendly cuss at times. And they start telling me their symptoms. Well, other therapists of one kind or another dread this because there'll be a whole litany of symptoms much of the time. Complaint and crying and pleading and all kinds of stuff like that. I tell them, gee, I'm really interested in your symptoms. They must be rather distressing to you. And I'd like to help you with them. So what I would like you to do is, I would like you to write down, carry a pad of paper and a pencil with you. I'd like you to write down every symptom you have during the day, at what time it occurred, how long it lasted, what did you do about them, and what did it help, or did it help? Oh, thank you, doctor, thank you. You're the only one who listens to me, etc. Oh. I come back the next day and I come in the ward, and guess who I can't find? But I make a point of locating them. And after all, I'm interested as a therapist. I have to help people. And I say, okay, let's go to work on your symptoms. Where's your list? Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't do it. Because if I did what you asked, I'd have no time for anything else. So I'm sorry, doctor, but I didn't do the list. Well, I guess it's not terribly important then to you. So since it's not important to you to discuss your symptoms, let's talk about something else. And we discuss real therapeutic material rather than I got a pain here and I got an ache there and stuff like that. And I haven't been sleeping too well either. You know, the hypochondriac's tombstone. Well, there are two versions of that. One says, I kept telling him I was sick. And the other, if I knew you were coming, I'd have faked an ache. So this is how we sometimes move the hypochondriac or the obsessive compulsive along. Some patients I deliberately intimidate. There are few patients, but I do. I found it to be very effective to say whatever I have to say, yelling at an obsessive compulsive. I will not say it quietly. So an obsessive compulsive calls me at home on Sunday and says, I just went to the refrigerator to get something and the light was out. Do you think somebody sneaked into my apartment and fooled around with the light? Maybe can have. And I said, get off the phone. If you want to be crazy on your own time, not mine. Or another obsessive compulsive. I was at somebody's wedding in my family, I don't remember whom now, and we had a youngster, 1-year-old maybe at the time, and we got a babysitter. I arranged with the answering service not to forward any calls to me, but to give them to another colleague. So the only person who knew where I was our babysitter. And while I'm sitting there at the wedding ceremony, hotel employee comes by, kneels by my seat, and says, you have a call in the anteroom. There's only one person who knows where I am. So I raced out into the anteroom and picked up the phone. And there was my patient who had gotten my phone number by telling the babysitter that this was an emergency. And she felt, well, if it's an emergency, I don't want to be held responsible for not passing it on. What was the emergency? Well, last night it was a hot night, so I got up at about 4 o'clock in the morning and I took a shower. You know how obsessive compulsives are about cleanliness. So, of course, it's necessary to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to shower. And while I was showering, I began to sing. And one of my neighbors was awakened. He got mad. Do you think he'll make trouble for me? I said, I don't know whether he'll make trouble for you or I'll make trouble for you. If you ever call me without it being a life and death emergency, you're going to be in big trouble. You may not be my patient. So after that, he would call, give the answering service a message if I was not available, and tell them it's not an emergency. So I saw drikers with an obsessive compulsive who wouldn't shut up and give Drikers a turn to say what he had to say. Drikers took a big library dictionary and bounced it on the floor. The patient was startled and shut up for a minute, at which point Drikers told him he would not tolerate that he'd like his therapist to have the feeling that he managed the therapy, not the patient. So other therapists cannot do it. Some can. And I found that I can manage some of the control that the patient tries to impose upon me and move on with him to something other than he's doing. So there is this kind of intimidation. I had a patient who was becoming a prescribed medication addict, and talking with her did not stop it. And finally I said to her, if you so much as take one pill without my permission, I don't care if it's an aspirin, then you will be an ex-patient here. I'll make you make referral to somebody else. She decided to find out. I said, well, do you have the name of another therapist you want to see, or shall I recommend one? And I am firm. I don't set too many limits on patients, but when I set them, I'm very firm about them. Now, I intimidate, but not deliberately. I told you this morning about I should and what it really means. So I recommend something and the patient says, okay, I ain't gonna do that either. They catch themselves in mid-flight and stutter a little bit, restrain themselves because they now know what it means, and they can't fake me out and they can't fake themselves out. They know it ain't gonna happen if they say I should. So many of them are intimidated even in terms of, I can't use this phrase, which I'd love to use. There are some people who use another technique. I don't use it. And that is, rewrite your early recollection to make it come out the way you would like it to come out. As I see it, it's based on a faulty notion that if you change the early recollection, then behavior will change too. And I think that happens, but you cannot prescribe it. So, in my travels, I found Adlerians who say, well, we do this. I've never been able to sell myself theoretically on the validity of that proposition. Another way of getting people to move is to frighten them. Now, I don't mean necessarily that you're deliberately going to use fear as a technique. But if I tell you that if you don't brush your teeth may rot, it may frighten you. So I had a patient who did not move. He had been seen by how many therapists, I don't know, but he did not move. He had a one-room apartment which he could not get into because garbage was piled in there from floor to ceiling. So he lived with his mother and paid rent on an apartment he never went into because he couldn't get into it really. And I had the same kind of tough time with him that other therapists had had. And I really just found it difficult to move him along. And one day, walking in the hall of the hospital, a physician, a urologist, approached me and said, what can you do about helping so-and-so? He has a hernia, it must be repaired. But if he keeps finding reasons not to schedule surgery, makes appointments for surgery and then has them canceled and changed, etc. And the urologist said, I've been trying this way and that way and the other way, etc. He says, nothing works. And he's going to be in real trouble if he doesn't have it done. So I said, well, I don't know if I can get him to do so, but I'll take a whack at it and see if I can. So I spoke with my patient, and he told me, well, right now he can't do it, maybe in a couple of months, and he can't do it for this reason, he can't do it for that reason, and all of that. And perhaps if I had not been, quote, frightened by the urologist about the seriousness of this thing, I wouldn't have proceeded this way. But I felt if I could, I'd get him into surgery. So I said, I was talking with Dr. So-and-so, and he told me that if you don't have your surgery done, you're going to have a strangulated hernia. And you could see the alarm in his face, partly because it sounded very serious to him, but partly because he didn't know what the word strangulate meant. So he said, what does that mean, strangulate? I said, nothing. You may merely lose your balls. He was in surgery the following week. So sometimes, deliberately or not deliberately, I scare patients into doing what they could do if they weren't so resistant and wanted to impede the progress of therapy. I'm sorry, I wasn't.
Sorry, I just said that's a tough price to pay for procrastinating.
So sometimes, in addition to intimidation, I use fear. But it's a rarely used technique. I don't really strike fear in the hearts of patients if I can possibly help it. And if I can find some other way of getting them to surgery, I'll prefer to use the other way rather than this very, very dramatic expression. But when all else fails, you do something else. Okay. Dan attuned me to look at my watch. I almost skipped your lunch today.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the time that yesterday we took 15 minutes, so we'll be back at 5:03.
Show up. Oh, yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean. And then the time will be there.
Hello, hello.
I don't know how you do it. But I like this show.
Let's talk about the resistant adolescent. Doesn't want to be there, ain't going to cooperate in any way, etc. Or even younger than adolescents, you find the same kind of thing. And for all practical purposes, they stand mute. And you may try to talk to them, and they look around or they look down, but they make it abundantly clear that they don't want to be there, and they aren't going to give you that much by way of information or feeling or whatever. And it's a big problem, because if they don't talk to you, there's a fair chance that nothing is going to happen. So we have had this kind of problem, my colleagues and I, and we've talked about it. And one way we get them into therapy is to use the co-therapy method. And the two therapists will not address the adolescent, but talk to each other. And they'll talk to each other about the patient. Gee, looks like a good kid. Yeah, probably is. But I wonder why he's not talking to us. Do you think it's here because it's happening because his parents sent him and he ain't going to give the parents the satisfaction? And we talk about him. And invariably they perk up their ears. Because if they don't listen to what the two therapists are saying, they might sneak up on him and that kind of thing. So at least we get them to listen, and that's a good first step. But secondly, one of the two therapists will make a deliberate error. this, the patient cannot stand. Because it's another evidence that he's being misunderstood and ganged up on and all of that kind of stuff. So he's busts out, even though he's decided he ain't gonna say one word, he busts out with, "Fat lot you guys know," etc., or some such thing like, "You think you know anything? Well, you don't know anything about me." And then, very, very gently, we say, "Well, we won't know very much about you unless you tell us. So since apparently we've said something wrong or done something wrong, why don't you set us straight?" And we begin therapy that way. I was just thinking during the break about what I like to call mantras, things that we tell patients to tell themselves, etc. And I was reminded of something that I was involved with many years ago. One of my colleagues at the hospital had a group therapy, and somehow it was growing stale. People were sitting around wondering whether they should return. They had nothing more to say, and all of that. So he invited me to sit in as second therapist to see whether I could ascertain why the group was growing stale. So I told him I would come in, but only as an observer, and then I would communicate to him what I had observed. And we told the group that I was only going to come in to observe. And one of the young fellas, about 25, something like that, said, "I got a problem." So the group was all ready to hear about this problem. He was living with a schizophrenic girl, and it was not a sexual relationship. She was poor, she was needy, and he was willing to help her out, give her a roof over her head. And after living this way for, I don't know, maybe a year, she suddenly suggested a sexual encounter. And now he didn't quite know, should he turn it into a sexual relationship or shouldn't he? He decided there'd be no harm. And they went to bed, and he couldn't perform. So she jumped out of bed, ran into the bathroom, got a razor, and slit her wrists. And she had slit her wrists many times before for other things. And each time he had called the police, who took her into the nearest emergency room, and they sewed her up and maybe even kept her for a while or put her in a state hospital. And then she came out and she was okay until she wasn't okay again. So that happened, and now she was back living with him. And what if she suggested sex again? If he rejected her, well, schizophrenics don't like rejection. They've had enough rejection in their lives. And if he did, what if he couldn't perform? Because if he couldn't perform, there'd be the razor blade, etc. So the group addressed that problem and what he could do about it. And it was not an Adlerian group. So they came up with all kinds of fancy reasons why he couldn't perform. He had castration fears and all that kind of stuff. And finally, listening to this, I thought, by golly, if he gets any more of this, he's going to be a wreck when he leaves. That's how helpful they were. So I decided to intervene, but I didn't have any plan on how to intervene. It was just an immediate moment decision. So I said, have you ever seen two dogs perform sexually? He said, yeah. I said, have you ever seen a male dog fail? And he said, no. And I said, well, how come male dogs never fail and male human beings do? And he said, well, that's because a dog knows what to do and knows how to do and doesn't. He doesn't think how long it is, how long it lasts, or any of these other things. He just knows this is what I want to do, and he does it. And now I had a possible solution for his problem. I said to him, well, if she suggests sex again, and you decide you want sex with her, after you get into bed, before you do anything, I want you, under your breath, to say, bow wow. Don't say it out loud because she'll think you're as crazy as she is. And the group looked at me to see if I was joking or not. I assured them that I was dead serious about this. And the group ended on that note. When he came back the following week, the group looked at him and his response was a satisfied, I bow wowed. So sometimes a mantra will get the patient to move. Coming back to adolescents, because they don't want therapy, most frequently at least, they come in and try to sell the therapist on no therapy for me, I ain't doing that. You're crazy, or my parents are crazy if you think I'm crazy, and similar statements. So what you have to do in terms of what I said last night, you have to turn them into a rabbit. Otherwise there's no rabbit stew. So when they say, I ain't going into therapy, I'm not going to let you do anything to me, etc., I say, wait a minute. Who says it's up to you? I don't know if I want you in therapy. I'm a busy therapist. I got a lot of people who want my services. So you'll give me 3 good reasons why I should accept you in therapy rather than somebody else who seeks my services. And suddenly, since it's not available to them, by golly, they want it terribly. So they give me 3 good reasons why they should be in therapy. And I decide in each instance whether I'm going to be satisfied with them. If the person really shows real motivation, I'll say, okay, you've sold me. When do you want to come in next? But if I'm not sure about their motivation, I tell them something else. Sorry, not good enough. You'll have to give me better reasons than that. And usually they wind up begging, please take me instead of somebody else. And this is another form of paradoxical technique which moves the patient from non-therapy to therapy very frequently. Another thing we use is the future autobiography. It can be done in several forms. One is, and you pick the time. Part of the choice of time depends on how old the patient is. 5 years from now or 10 years from now, where would you like to be in life? And you check each of the life tasks, etc. And when the patient is through telling you that, we talk about whether it is desirable or possible. But of the possibles, you say, okay, we have an agenda for talking about where you want to go and how to get there. Another form of asking the same thing is, where do you think you will be? Not where would you like to be, where do you think you will be 10 years from now? You may get signs of depression in the answer. My parents will never be happy with me unless I turn into a judge or a this or a that or whatever. And using those two questions, you can move the patient along. Another technique you might use in moving the patient is to ask him or her, who is the person in history you most admire? You may find through the answer the direction that the person would like to head in and move them in that direction. Next, if you're competent enough to interpret dreams, the dream is a problem-solving activity, and consequently, you may look at the solutions that the person is proposing to himself and help him make certain decisions about whether to do A or B and how to do A or B and that kind of thing, and move them along. Sometimes, with some patients, I give them gold stars. It's especially effective with children. But even with an adult, it's a symbol of, okay, I licked this problem. And I'm proud of myself for licking this problem. Oh, I forgot to tell you something about voluntary mutism. I found a way, not too long ago, perhaps within the last 2 years, of getting kids who won't talk to me to talk to me. One of my colleagues caught me just as I was leaving the office for the day and said, "Harold, would you stop it? I'm having a problem with a patient. I got this 10-year-old kid, and he won't say a word to me." And I wanted to get home. My dinner was waiting. I didn't want to spend a whole hour with this kid trying to get him to talk. And if I tried to get him to talk, I might not succeed even in an hour because my colleague had not succeeded. And I walked in, and before I thought what I was going to say, I said it. I looked at the kid and I said, "Okay, tell me how crazy your parents are." And he didn't expect that. So he told me how crazy his parents were. And he thought I was a pretty sympathetic person for understanding how crazy his parents were. And I said, "Okay, now you can continue with Dr. Farmeland and tell him the rest of how crazy." Therapy began. And this is again another paradoxical technique and part of the way a crazy therapist operates. You see, he does the unexpected. So I'm getting better at that. I talk to a lot of people who would not ordinarily speak to me, having developed some of these techniques over the passage of time, and some very, very recently, because I'm always trying to figure out how to do it better. You have your hand up? Oh. Well, for that matter, I better ask, what do you want to ask about all the stuff we've been talking about in a day and a half?
You mentioned psychopaths yesterday. What strategies do you primarily use in treating psychopaths?
You're asking for strategies, not tactics.
Yes.
Well, the bad name that they used to have when I was a student, constitutional psychopathic inferiors. Now, how much hope would you have for a person who is diagnosed with that? So-called CPIs. So on that basis, your question would have been irrelevant. It is not today. Well, nobody could cure anybody who was so sorely afflicted. A terrible person. Below human, infrahuman. After all, they were inferiors. So at that time, I wouldn't have to answer your question at all. I would merely say, we don't treat them. And they were not treated. And then when such people as Robert Lindner came along, we decided we better deal with these people, find out who they really are psychologically, and see if we can do something about it. Now, your question, I don't know whether you know enough about psychopathology to know this. There are two kinds of psychopaths. One is the aggressive psychopath, many times a criminal. They kill, they forge, they lie, they steal, etc. And then there are the other kinds of psychopaths who are getting psychopaths. They want to get stuff, they want to get fame, they want to get adoration, and that kind of thing. So what you would do with one group, you would not do with the other group. When I say,
It's the former group that I'm interested in. In Minnesota, we have a facility called the Minnesota Sex Offender Treatment Program that houses 400 plus and soon almost 1,000 individuals who are going to be committed as sexual psychopathic personalities, and not one person has been successfully treated in this program. That's why I asked this question.
Well, I was about to say that.
Mhm.
Now, these programs do not succeed for several reasons, not only because we don't know what to do about them, even though we don't know in many cases what to do about them. But in addition to that, there's the matter of prognosis. There is still the feeling in the field that these people are not amenable to treatment. And if you believe that they're not amenable to treatment, they're not amenable to treatment.
That's right.
Third is, almost all of them are mandated patients. They don't come in and say, I need therapy. They come in and they say, the court sent me. And with mandated patients, you do not have a rabbit. They're not there because, gee, I hurt. Generally, they're there because I hurt somebody, not because I hurt, like the neurotic or psychotic comes in and one way or another says, I hurt. So, if patients are not rabbits, then you will not succeed, not only in helping them, you will not succeed in treating them. So, not one of them gets help because not one of them is seeking treatment. So you cannot treat one of these people until you figure out what will sell them on the notion of treatment. And here and there you occasionally find one of these psychopaths who decides, enough of this way of life. I think I want to change. Do you know where you see them? On Johnny Carson, Jay Leno, and etc. And do you know why they appear? Because they're card sharps, or they're familiar with counterfeit money, and they give you a lesson on TV on how to not be taken at the gambling tables, or how to keep your house safe. One of my friends, a Houston psychologist, says when she leaves town, she takes her jewelry and she wants to keep it safe. She puts it in the vegetable crisper in her refrigerator, and by golly, nobody would ever think to do that. Almost the next week, I saw one of these guys on TV. He says, the first place we look is in the vegetable crisper. And that changed my friend's hiding habits. You see them in contexts like that. They use their conning experience to tell other people this is the way not to be conned. So occasionally you see somebody who reforms, at least to some extent, etc. But most of them are mandated patients. So the first thing you have to figure out is how to grow ears on them, how to turn them into a rabbit. Now that's pretty hard, it ain't easy. If you've ever been in love with somebody who didn't return that love, and you tried somehow or other to sort of talk them into loving you, doesn't work. So, people who are not rabbits don't easily turn into rabbits. I don't think your hospital or whatever it is, agency is very different from most agencies of this kind. We appropriate money, we keep them off the streets, but we don't have the first notion of how to treat them. And that doesn't suggest that I or Adlerians have the secret of treating them, but we know some of the reasons why they don't respond to treatment. And the first reason is they're not in treatment. They may be there seeing therapists, but they're not in treatment. So the first strategy is making them rabbits. And with the aggressive psychopath, it's very, very difficult. With the getting psychopath, it is not so difficult because these people will impersonate people. And they're friendly and that kind of thing. And if you say, gee, you need therapy, they may figure, gee, I'll do it, it's a lark. That kind of thing. I forget his name now, but they made a movie out of it with Tony Curtis.
Houdini?
It was a true story.
Is it Houdini?
And this guy had quit high school, it wasn't for him, and he lived a life of impersonation. So he stole some credentials and became a professor of French. And then he stole some other credentials and became a professor of psychology and did reasonably well. So that he didn't get found out or fired.
Or they said that he'd become a doctor and do surgery too.
Yes, indeed. He became a Trappist monk and was successful at that. Then he became the assistant warden of a penitentiary in Texas and did well at that. And they got after him after a while in the law, so he escaped to Canada in World War II. Ferdinand Damara was his name, it just came to me. And he didn't have any way to keep himself alive in Canada. He didn't have a work permit. But it being the war, he signed up in the Navy and told him he was a surgeon. So he became the lone doctor on some ship of war. And one night, a sailor came down with appendicitis. And they couldn't get him to a land facility where they could perform surgery. So they decided that the ship's doctor had to perform surgery the next day, otherwise the patient, the sailor, would die. So he sat up much of the night, read a book on surgery that the Navy had provided, and he operated very, very successfully on this sailor. And later, when he was found out, they examined the sailor and they found that he had done a very superb job. And this guy, if he had used his talents in a positive way, would have burnt up the world. You see. And a very, very agreeable guy. People love to talk to him and be in his company. And so that's why I said this kind of psychopath is different than... In fact, I won't ask it the way I'd like to ask it. How many of you remember Prince Michael Romanov? I'm the only old person. A guy by the name of, a con man by the name of Harry Gergeson in Brooklyn decided on a different kind of life. He wasn't going to be merely Harry Gergeson, a nobody from Brooklyn. So he moved to Hollywood, to Beverly Hills more exactly. And he let the word out that he was Prince Michael Romanov of the Russian dynasty, Romanov dynasty. And of course, actors and actresses and other rich people fell all over themselves wanting to entertain him and have him around and that kind of thing. And he announced to them that he was thinking as a project of opening a restaurant in Beverly Hills. As soon as he got more financing, people fell all over themselves trying to buy a piece of this new restaurant. And he opened up the new restaurant. It was called Romanoff's. And then he was exposed. And everybody knew he was Harry Ferguson, not Prince Michael Romanoff. But that didn't bother either him or them. His restaurant was a huge success. It was the place to see and be seen and all of that kind of stuff. People still continue to lend him money for various projects. And even though they knew he was a fake, that didn't stop him. Both sides cooperated very, very well in this. And he was Prince Michael Romanoff until he died. A huge fraud. But used his fraudulency in a more constructive manner than the kind of psychopath you're asking about. Yeah. Anything else you want to ask about any of the stuff we talked about last night, tonight, this morning, and this afternoon?
In interviewing, in a first interview, I had an incident where I was talking to somebody and this person has an addiction. And one of my guidance people said you should confront that person and challenge them with that addiction in the first interview. I wanted to ask you if you would do that.
You mean the person is not admitting that he is addicted?
Right.
Because if he comes in, you don't have to confront him with "you're an addict."
Right. Yeah. Right.
He knows he's an addict. There's no need to confront. Well, you see, I don't confront them with the notion that they're an addict or not an addict. If you do that and the person is trying to keep it a secret from you, the time to expose it is not in the first interview, because the patient will run. He not only will run, he may even be predisposed to run. He's already made up his mind that if they ask me this, if they tell me this, then I'm out of here.
Right.
So I generally let the patient talk and I don't confront him with that. But that's not only true of addiction, it's of anything else of that kind. You see, if a therapist is too smart in the first interview, the patient may scoot, because the therapist might see through all my defenses. So what good is that going to do me? I'll probably perish if. So I wait till later. I get acquainted and I try to win the patient. If I can win the patient, he might somewhere along the line tell me. And if he doesn't tell me, if I've won him over, I'll tell him. So, you see, there are certain things that people think are rather special, and they're outside the general rules, whatever they may be. And people who are addicts are people. They're no different than you or anybody else in that particular sense. They're people. And as people, regardless of what their troubles are, they behave like people. You know, it's not a special category. You see. And even given certain prohibitions, I still treat homosexuals who want my services. I don't think that there's anything special about homosexuality. And I'm committed to helping those people, regardless of what their diagnosis or whatever, whom I am capable of helping. There's nothing special about alcoholism. They're people. So, the question of what do you do with this or that or the other, as if there's a special kind of therapy that applies only to them. If you do good therapy, it's probably applicable to anybody who consults you. Now, they may not let it happen, as I pointed out, but nothing special. So I do not diagnose people except for insurance purposes. Other than that, I don't care what your diagnosis is, because I never treat a schizophrenic, I never treat anxiety disorder, I never treat an obsessive compulsive. I treat people. I don't treat diagnoses. And for that matter, what I might do with one obsessive compulsive, I might not do with another obsessive compulsive. So I do not know how to treat diagnoses. Psychiatrists are better at that than I am. If you have this disorder, you get this pill. If you have that disorder, you get that pill. Well, if you feel that, then you know how to treat diagnoses. And psychiatrists are taught these days, not earlier, are taught these days to treat diagnoses. If a person's depressed, you give them this antidepressant or that antidepressant, etc. And they don't basically care about the people. I've had many, many patients who are seen for medication by psychiatrists. And I say, what do you talk about? They say, well, about whether the last pill helped me or needs more or less dosage. And I don't subscribe to that, and I don't work that way. And if you ask me how to treat A, I don't know. I know how to treat a specific whatever, but I don't know how to treat a hysteric. And they have tried over the past several decades to get me at my school to teach a course on the treatment of the bipolar disorder or something. And I tell them, ask somebody else. I don't know how to treat the bipolar disorder. Well, you see so many bipolars. I say, yeah, one at a time. I know how to treat them. So, you see, I don't know how to treat addicts. I treat a hell of a lot of them, but I don't know how to treat them, except one by one. You see, Wendy, if you treat diagnoses, you're violating one of the basic assumptions of Adlerian psychology. Did you know that?
Please fill me in.
The uniqueness of the personality. How do you treat addicts as all addicts are alike? And since they're all alike, you treat them all the same. And if you do that, then the uniqueness of the personality might be an answer that gets you an A on an exam here, but it has nothing to do with your treatment of people or your knowledge of Adlerian psychology. And that's what I treat them one at a time means. Every person is unique, independent of diagnosis. So I only know how to treat them one at a time. I don't know how to treat them as a group. Yes.
As long as we're kind of on this, one of my frustrations as an Adlerian seems to be that, the tied so closely now to the medical model and, the evidence-based practice and the Adlerians really don't have a whole lot of research, that it just seems to be more and more pressure that, on getting research out there for this just to fit in. And yet, as Adlerians, I don't feel like we really do fit into that medical model, but we're kind of stuck there.
Good observation, good question, but there are several answers for it, nevertheless. First of all, Adlerians, by and large, are not medical model therapists. We don't have many psychiatrists in the movement, but some of them are medical model. But by and large, if you talk to an Adlerian, you'll find out that he's not a medical model therapist. I won't go into some of the other things that they are or not, et cetera, but I'd like to get to the question of absence of research. You are quite right that Adlerians don't do very much research. They're getting better at the lousier forms of research. And they're not the only ones guilty of that. One of the best ways to get a doctorate at a U.S. university is to do some trivial research that nobody cares about. The early recollections of cosmetologists. Well, there are probably some cosmetologists who are interested in that. But gee, that's Adlerian research. I've gotten along for, this is my 68th year in practice without knowing the early recollections of cosmetologists, and I probably will go to my deathbed without great concern about that. So, in the field itself, people do lousy research. They don't use control groups. They don't use the proper statistical methods and that kind of thing. And Adlerians are not left out. They're just as gifted in doing lousy research as any people. And that's unfortunate, not about Adlerians specifically, but about the field in itself. And people are put under pressure to do research, or put themselves under pressure to do research. I got to keep my job, I got to get a promotion, and my school values research, and they put themselves under pressure, or put under pressure to do research. But did it ever occur to you that Alfred Adler or Sigmund Freud could not have gotten a doctorate at almost any American university? Their contribution, de facto, was worthless because it was not based on research. Well, I happen to feel to the contrary, that a good theoretical hypothesis is also important. And certainly Adler and Freud and others like them came up with a number of theoretical hypotheses, some of which are better than others, but at least they came up with them. And the assumption was that unless something could be demonstrated through research, and especially with numbers, it was worthless. That was the view. And in Europe, it was especially so. They did not value it. at universities the importance of research as Americans did, and in some instances they even discouraged research. So since Adlerian psychology started in Vienna, there was no great impetus to do research studies. Well, here my own belief is, if you're going to turn out this research junk, as I call it, I just assume you didn't do it. They're better to waste your time, go to the movies, or some such thing like that, because it will contribute nothing to humanity and perhaps very little to you. Nevertheless, I feel that there is good research where people come up with good hypotheses which are socially meaningful. You know, that's important to us Adlerians, that are based on good design and research methods and that kind of, you're going to do that kind of research. I'll help fund it. But the other kind of research I'm not really terribly interested in. If a student comes to me and says, I'd like you to be chairman of my committee, I say, find somebody else. I happen to be busy right now. Because it's not really, as far as I'm concerned, important research. So you find some people doing good research among the Adlerians. What is the Adlerian group at Georgia State, led by Roy Kern? James Crandall, I don't know where he is now, last I heard he was in Idaho, does good research. Avi Raffaelli in Houston, Texas, does good research. But culture has changed. And our students get lazier. And research is hard work. And it's not only hard work. If you do good research, you have to think. And students abhor that. Give me a handout. Tell me the answers on the exam so that I won't even have to study for that. You know, that kind of stuff. And therefore, where there used to be, every psychologist, me included, knew I got to do some research because that's what the field is like. That's what's demanded of psychologists. Now, you want to do research, do research. You don't want to do research, don't do research. Except for the few people who care. Most psychologists don't care. They graduate doing research for their doctoral dissertation, and they never do one bit of research again their whole careers. Well, I think that's unfortunate. I think good research is important. I think bad research is irrelevant and a time waster. Does that attend to your question?
I have a question. Dr. Mosak, have you seen in the people that you treat that their early recollections, like people with mental illness, that their early recollections could have been an indication that they were going to have problems later on?
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
Well, I'm not dodging it to dodge it, you know. But that's a question about causality. And Adlerians don't deal with causality.
I realize that, but there seems
Well,
to be
you realize it, so act like an Adlerian.
But there seems to be a correlation of some sort with mistaken beliefs and early recollections.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Well, it seems that.
What does that mean, it seems?
Well,
You looked up at the stars and by God,
no,
it said...
well, I did my
what's-
master's thesis on this, and in the case study that I did, there seemed to be
I don't accept it seems.
Okay.
That's one of two phrases I don't accept. The other one is they say. You never know who they are, but they say.
Okay. Well, I probably can't get around this. But
I can't answer those questions.
okay.
Yes.
I have a question that is similar to the gentleman's question in the back about our culture
Yeah.
and the changes you must have seen all along the way about as far as communication and the effects that computers and iPods and AV equipment has changed our culture, and how have you stayed hopeful through all this time, seeing those changes?
How have I stayed hopeful with the
Because-
changes in culture?
Yeah.
Well, that's begging the question because I've not always stayed hopeful.
Well, I
Some of the things that go on in culture terrify me. And I don't see much in the near future about changing them. You know, when you live as long as I have, life keeps changing, the world keeps changing, people keep changing, etc. And you got to decide what you're going to put up with and what you're not going to put up with. No. Some people put up with little. The old ways were the best. And, why can't the world stand still? In church on Sunday nights when I was in the Army, we sang the hymn, "Give me that old time religion." Give me that old time religion was good enough for Grandpappy and Grandmammy, and it's good enough for me. On that basis, you reject any change. And then there are the people who are for change no matter what it is. It can be the craziest, it can be, you know, like some of the cults and that kind of thing. You wonder how people can succumb to that. But obviously they do. And as I answered her, I don't know how to treat them except one by one too, and I've treated some people who have been caught up in cult behavior. So basically, myself, I'm not resistant to change. In most things, I am certainly not resistant to reasonable change in thought. But I still don't own a cell phone. I've lived very, very well, lived a good life without a cell phone. And if I could do that for over 80 years, I guess, again, I can go to my deathbed without owning it. Somehow I managed. I didn't have to have a phone glued to my ear every hour of the day. If somebody wanted to find me, it was rather infrequent that they had to find me this minute.
Yeah.
And there are people who find themselves in a position where they have to be found this minute. That's why Patrick made the announcement this morning, would you please shut off your cell phones? Now, if you do have cell phones and you come to a place like this, you shouldn't have to be asked. You ought to know that if you don't turn off your cell phone, it's going to hurt people. They aren't going to be able to hear, they're going to be distracted, whatever. You see, but they aren't going to turn it off. What if in the minute they turn it off, somebody wants to reach them as if, you know, this is the end of the world? Now, maybe a doctor may have to be reached immediately, a volunteer fireman might have to be reached immediately, but most people don't have to be reached immediately. And as I say, I've lived all my life, and if anybody wanted to reach me if I was not available now, well, they'll try again later in the day or tomorrow or something. And if it were really urgent, they'd find some way of tracking me down. So, some changes I accept, some I don't. Basically, I think about them and decide what I'm going to do about them. Oh, I've made a decision how much computerese I'm going to learn. And I decided I'm not going to become an IT person. If I can get a letter or paper done on Word and construct a database like adlerbiblio.com, that's enough for me. I don't have to worry about spreadsheets. I figured out my finances with pen and paper long before spreadsheets. If you prefer to fool around with spreadsheets, bless you. I ain't gonna. So, I have encountered major changes over the years in psychology. And it's not only been in assessment and therapy, but in all kinds of other things. For one thing, everybody wants a piece of my practice, not in terms of ownership, but in telling me what I can do and what I can't do. I don't go along with that change, as I pointed out last night. See, other people want to do it, that's fine. That's not me. Certain things have changed. It was not important in the early 1940s to know anything about substance abuse. The only substance abusers were musicians, generally, and if they sought treatment at all, like Gene Krupa, they found it in the Public Health Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, which was the only substance abuse facility in the whole United States. In my psychopathology training, I got one lecture on all of substance abuse. Well, as culture changed, I had to learn about this because people were seeking my help in dealing with substance abuse, and if I didn't know something about it, I wasn't going to provide that help. I was not taught very much in the way of testing, so as each one, as the Rorschach came out, as the TAT came out, as the Wexler came out, I had to learn all of this stuff. And vice versa, a lot of the stuff I learned was no longer valid. So I had to learn. My teachers were wrong about that, or the books were wrong about that. You want to know one such thing? You will laugh. In psychology, there's the institution of ABEP, the American Board of Professional Psychology. And if you take their exams after 5 years of supervised clinical experience, and you pass the exams, they will certify you as a specialist. So, a lot of people thought that that was important, and they took the exams and passed, or sometimes didn't pass, etc., and that was that. In the early 1950s, I decided I was going to become a specialist. In other words, I was going to take the exams. And I made a decision which some of my friends thought was crazy. I decided not to study for it. My feeling was that I learned enough in college and enough in the 5 years that I could pass without studying. And I was married and had a youngster, and why spend time studying when you got time to enjoy your family and all of that? And I didn't really worry about it not studying. Because unlike in college where I felt it was important to get an A, here I just had to get 1 point above failing, and that was it. So I didn't have to know everything. I felt I knew enough to pass with even a minimum grade. Well, the night before the exam, the written part of the exam, I suddenly got the willies. And I thought, gee, they might ask me something on neurology. And, you know, I used to be in the neurology ward regularly every day. At that time I was up on it, but maybe in the 10 years since, you know, I didn't know this and forgotten that. Maybe things changed. So I got out a neurology book, pick up enough neurology and remind myself of what I knew so that the next day I'd be able to answer those questions if asked. So I saw the section on the epilepsies, and I knew enough about the epilepsies. I was still working with them, so I just glossed over that. I didn't bother too much reading it in depth. And then I came to a section called the senile dementias. And the first one was Alzheimer's disease. And I still remember the first statement. Alzheimer's rare. Fewer than 25 cases are known in the whole medical literature. Well, if there are only 25 people with that, I probably ain't ever going to see one, and certainly they're not going to ask me about that. Of course, today, a good neurologist may see 25 in one day. But that was the status of our knowledge at the time. So I said, well, heck, I know enough about Alzheimer's disease that I can get by with it. Again, I don't have to get an A. So I went to the next section. It was Pick's disease. And it said, Pick's disease is even rarer than Alzheimer's disease. I didn't read that at all. Heck, with fewer than 25 people ever being seen, why the heck would they ask me about Pick's disease? So I went and took the exam the next morning, and guess what the first question was? Describe Pick's disease. I was furious. They didn't ask me questions about the stuff that I see every day. You know, the neuroses, they have to pick on Pick's disease, which I probably would never encounter in my life. Well, as I said, I didn't have to pass by much. They never gave me a grade. They just told me I passed, so fine. So about 6 or 7 months later, Dreikers and I were in the office, and he knocked on my door and he said, Harold, come on in my office. I'd like you to talk to my patient. Well, there was something he frequently did. So I went into his office, and here was this woman in her 50s and behaving very, very erratically, especially sexually. And I conducted an interview with her and that kind of thing. And when I finished what I had to ask, I turned to Dreikers and Dreikers said, I think she's schizophrenic. What do you think? And I said, I don't think she's schizophrenic. He said, well, what do you think it is? I said, I don't know, but I think it is something in the neurological field. But it doesn't seem to me to be schizophrenic. So he said, okay. We'll see who is right. Not in any competitive way. We had a neurologist across the hall, not in our practice. So we had her make an appointment with the neurologist who had been in practice a long time. And he called us after a while and he said, "Thank you for referring Mrs. So-and-so. It's the first patient with Pick's disease I've ever seen." So even with a person sitting right in front of me with Pick's disease, I didn't recognize it. So those kinds of things have changed. There are plenty of people with Alzheimer's that we now are obliged to see or treat or refer or do something about. And as I pointed out to somebody, I think of this last night, nobody spoke of anorexia. I got absolutely no training in anorexia. Everything I know about anorexia I had to learn later on in my career because we never saw them, we were never interested in them. And except for this paper in the British Adlerian Journal in, I think, 1928, I wouldn't even have known the term, much less how to treat it. So it says that if you want to be a psychotherapist, you've got to keep abreast of the times, not only of your reading of journals and books, etc., but you have to keep at least some acquaintanceship with cultural shift and cultural change. And it means a lifelong period of learning, because there's always something new coming up. And because of the so-called bandwagon effect, we have to learn a lot of things that we have to unlearn. So you get some kind of fad in psychology, Ralphing, or some such thing like that. By the time you learn about Ralphing, nobody's doing it anymore. Requires a lifetime of learning. So I look at my watch and I see I've run over again, a chronic ailment of mine. Thank you so much for bringing me to Minnesota.
Just a couple quick things. Again, if you need any information about CEUs, this isn't a pre-approved presentation, but here's some information that you could use to probably claim credit. I want to encourage you to take one of these, which is a description of some of the things going on here. There's a lot of really exciting things about to happen here, and in fact, one of them is that eventually we'll have the Harold Mosak Auditorium. We'll also have the Miriam Pugh Family Education Center. Take one of these. Who's this? I know. We'll get to know her this evening. I know a Min Pugh. We can use that too. Well, it'll be up to Mill. But anyway, I think just one quick comment. What comes to mind in listening to Dr. Mosak is something that I often say, which is we have lots and lots of smart people in this world. We have lots and lots of smart people in this profession. We just don't have a lot of wise people. Probably not enough wise people to go around, and I think you'd probably join me in concluding he's a pretty wise man.
Yeah.
So we want to thank you for sharing your wisdom today and last evening. Thank you very much.
Right? Oh.